resume with our event today. And let me just start by saying welcome back after the nice lunch that we had today, and welcome back to our first session this afternoon, which looks like it's going to be very interesting because it is on the an area which has attracted a lot of attention in recent years, which is the security sector reform in the Balkans. In line with the reform, we have reformed the order of the papers today, so it's not going to be as originally set up there on the screen. We're going to have a slightly different order, and we're going to have Nihat presenting first, then it's going to be Nikolai, Marko, and Svete last. So we're going to start with Nihat, who is going to present his paper on the evolution of civil-military relations and the democratization of the Balkans, which is a very interesting overview of this kind of topical issue of the civil and military relations in the region. Nihat Celik, who was born in 1984, is a PhD student at Kadir Has University, and his research is in the area of national security, and his interests include political history, Balkan history and politics, Ottoman diplomacy, and security studies. We'll start with that.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. After the nice lunch, I think it would be hard for all of us to concentrate on the session. My topic is the evolution of civil-military relations and democratization in the Balkans. As you know, civil-military relations have always been problematic throughout history, and it is today more important in the Balkan countries because it coincided with the security sector reform, which includes the formation of the armed forces, the custom officials, the intelligence units, and police and paramilitary forces. Establishing a balanced and well-functioning civil-military relations would, of course, without no doubt, will determine the path of the success of those reforms. As you know, the modern concept of state is based on the premise that state has the monopoly over the use of force in a defined territory. And since the first centuries or first emergence of political entities, it was the need, the search for security, which caused the emergence of states through the passage from hunting and gathering societies to state establishment period. However, political entities always created bodies responsible for security, but it brought problems with it because you create a strong, a very disciplined body with all necessary weapons and ammunition, and with a strong institutional belonging idea, you create this body with the taxes paid by citizens. It could also sometimes pose a problem to democracy. It could challenge the regimes in the countries. So it makes the issue of civil-military relations more important today. With the advance of democratic regimes in the world, no matter how mature they are, the issue gained more importance, and in the 1990s, in the documents of OSCE and NATO, in NATO's membership action plans, it found its place as a universal norm. Then what is it? First, it is not only a matter of preventing the military from seizing power. It's about aligning the goals of political and military leaders sufficiently that military interests do not overtake the broader social interests. It's about not allowing the military to subvert democratic constitutional authority or to absorb a disproportionate amount of resources related to other social values and priorities, while ensuring that military can and does fulfill its functions through the provision of adequate resources. As can be understood from that passage, it is about a clear balance of power between civilian authorities and the military as an institution. Political scientists working in this field, like Samuel Huntington, proposed different theories in that field. Huntington argued that democratic control can be realized in two different ways. The first one is subjective control, in which the armed forces is completely politicized, with all officers belonging to the dominant political party, and the civilian power is maximized. Civilians have a great influence on military affairs. And the second way is objective control. It can be observed in democratic societies, and in that kind of democratic control, the military has a defined room for maneuver. It has some sort of independence regarding military matters, but they don't interfere in politics. And civilians do not interfere in military affairs neither. Huntington, of course, was later criticized by other theorists like Morris Janowitz, who argued in the 1960s that as a result of the changes in technology, modern militaries are prone to interfere in politics when compared with the past. And Bengt Abrahamsson in 1972 argued that apart from influencing politics, military is itself a politicized interest group. So they have varying degrees of influence over politics. The problem emerged from the case because there is no unified theory to define democratic civilian control of the military. Why? All countries in the world have different constitutional systems, different historical experiences, it's determined by the role perception of the military, or the values or the roles attributed by the general society to the armed forces. Sometimes in some societies where the people lost all their hope from political parties, from civilian power, they tend to see the military intervention as legitimate, because they believe only the military has the capacity to stabilize the country. So currently no explicit, comprehensive and consistent system of democratic governance of the armed forces exists. In the case of former communist countries, many analysts make mistakes by applying the models which are very useful in the case of Latin American countries, where the armed forces established regimes and after some period of time gradually leave in politics and return into their barracks. But that is not suitable for the post-communist Balkan countries. Against this background, we can define some characteristics of democratic civilian control of the armed forces. They are firstly constitutional, legal, and/or institutional constraints forbidden the involvement of the military as an institution, as distinct from individual soldiers as voters, because as being citizens, they have the right to vote in domestic politics. Secondly, a clear chain of command of the armed forces with democratically elected leaders at its head. Thirdly, a civilian Ministry of Defense and a Ministry of Defense staffed at least in part by civilians, not totally, but at least partly staffed by civilians. Fourthly, the subordination of the military general staff to the Ministry of Defense. And lastly, a degree of transparency with regard to defense budget. Since the fall of communism, Balkan countries in 1990s entered into a period of transition. In 1990s, many people were very optimistic. They thought it would happen overnight. We can transform those countries, but later the events showed that it's not going to be that easy. It is not easy to give a general pattern on the civil-military relations in the Balkans, but we can at least define some general characteristics. As you know, in the 19th century, with their independence wars, irregular forces played an important role. And in the 19th century, militaries in Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Romania, in Serbia, in Greece, played important roles in politics. And in the interwar era, we witnessed military coups in Balkan countries. After the Second World War, when communist administrations were established, the army was seen as a tool of the ancien regime. So the communist suspicions of the armed forces manifested themselves in recurring purges, the numerous political control mechanisms intended to ensure the armed forces' reliability, the high Communist Party membership rates among professional military personnel, and the party's maintenance of special security forces and militias, like the Securitate in Romania during the Ceausescu regime. They were seen as the last line of defense for the regime. For example, in 1947, one-third of the Bulgarian officers' corps was dismissed. They were seen unloyal to the new regime, and the new ones were politically appointed, and the promotions were sometimes based on political criteria rather than professional ones. During the Cold War era, we can say that Communist Party had a full control over the military. There was some sort of strong civilian control, but that is not the point where we are today. We have to broaden the sense we look at the civil-military relations. Civilian control alone is not enough. It should be defined as civilian democratic control. Otherwise, Adolf Hitler, too, had a very strong civilian control over the German armed forces in the Nazi regime. And it should be civilian and also democratic. The legacy of the communist era is that while the armed forces were kept out of domestic politics, the army was left a room of maneuver for army matters related with defense. And the legacy that's still going on in most Balkan countries is the lack of civilian experts on defense, because in the communist period, those posts in the Ministry of Defense were filled with military personnel. And today, if we focus on civil-military relations in the post-communist Balkans, we can see that 1990s was like a lost decade for many Balkan countries because of wars. But war also brought many problems like paramilitary forces, criminal networks, corruption, and etc. And countries like Bosnia-Herzegovina had to establish their armed forces from the beginning, also Slovenia and Croatia, based on territorial defense forces. NATO and EU support made it easier or encouraged the transformation of civil-military relations in those countries. But firstly, those countries after independence or after the war renewed their constitutions, severed the links between the party and the armed forces. However, in practice, there are still problems, lack of civilian experts, and the low level of parliament's oversight on defense matters, and the uninterested public in defense matters are still the problem. So we can say that first-generation reforms like setting up legal frameworks were mostly successful in Balkan countries, but the second-generation reforms that are about the consolidation of those first-generation reforms are still waiting to be strong. And on the other side of the coin, we shouldn't see the military as enemy of the democracy, because we know that from the events in 1990s in Romania, when the government wanted to use the armed forces against protesters, the miners' strike in Romania, and also tried to influence the elections in Bucharest, municipal elections, by transporting soldiers from other cities to the Bucharest. And civilians also have the capability to abuse the military. So it is not one-sided story. We should be also careful on civilians' approach to the military. Thank you a lot for your patience.
Thank you, Nihat, for this good overview of the question, the problem of the civil-military relations. And we will continue now with the case of Bulgaria and the the reform of the security sector reform there, which will be a paper presented by Nikolai Pavlov from the Bulgarian Academy of Science. And Nikolai holds an MA in International Relations from Faculty of Law of Sofia University, and he's doing a PhD in security studies as well. He is an expert, security expert at the Center for National Security and Defense Research at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, but he also, interestingly, is one of the experts that work for the 7th Framework Program, and he's responsible for he's the Bulgarian national contact person for that program. So.
Thank you, Mrs. Chairman. Yes, this is my presentation. Dear colleagues, we're in the afternoon, which is a difficult period of the day. People are getting tired after such a beautiful event. I would like first to thank the organizers for this opportunity. Everything is perfect up to the moment. Thank you, really. You did a lot of job, and you've gathered really very proficient and prospective young researchers. My presentation is on the democratic control of armed forces and security sector reform in Bulgaria. We've heard a very profound presentation on fighting organized crime in Bulgaria. But I will focus on the army, on the Bulgarian armed forces, and on their place in the security sector reform of Bulgaria. First, a short introduction, which is connected with what Nihat just presented. I would focus on the geopolitical roots of democratic control and the security sector reform. These concepts are not new, but they have gained new momentum and new popularity during the integration process in NATO and in the European Union. I would call them SSR and DKF are key words in the new speak of international relations after the end of the Cold War. The fundamental principle is the primacy of policy and of political leadership over the military, the police, and all the security forces. This is the main focus of Samuel Huntington's book monograph on the soldier and the state. It's interesting to note that at the time when he wrote this book, Huntington was 29 years old, which is interesting for the record. Maybe the next Huntington is somewhere in, at least the Balkan Huntington is somewhere in this conference hall. Although his book was criticized, it is still one of the main research, one of the main monographs in terms of civil-military relations, and there is no other comprehensive theoretical study on this subject. Of course, its main focus is on civil-military relations in the United States, but there are also other case studies about Russia and other countries. So we must base our work on civil-military relations on this seminal book. After that, I would like to stress the fact that democratic control of the armed forces and security sector reform are constantly developing concepts in a permanently changing international environment. You know, in Geneva there is a Geneva Center for Democratic Control over the Armed Forces. There will be representatives in the next days from DICAF. If you see their papers at the beginning of this century, they differ compared with the latest papers. So it's an evolving concept, and this is good for us. We can contribute as members of this security community, and we can contribute to modify it and to make it really a tool for making democracy work. Because as all of you know, it's not always working as it should be. So I will be critical about the state of democratic control over the armed forces and about the state of security sector reform in Bulgaria. We have reached our peak, our success during the accession period in NATO and in the EU, 2004 and 2007. Until then, we had a lot of work done, and we are considered a country that has successfully fulfilled the requirements of NATO and of the EU in this sphere, and we have filled the so-called second generation of SR reforms. But after that, I think there is a slowing down of the process and even turning back in some respects. I will focus on six main defining features of the KF and SR in Bulgaria that are problematic. 6 negative trends. This is to show you that the membership in EU and NATO does not automatically lead to the best model, and there is no best model, in fact. So first, we have very high level of politicization of the KF and SR, bordering on attempts at new forms of party control. Now, we have many parties that change. The ruling party, of course, is changing, but every party wants to put its party cadres on top of the armed forces, and even on positions that are usually considered for professional. And people who are with political background are put on positions that should be taken by professionals. This is one of the problems. Secondly, the deficiencies in the democratic process and representative democracy in Bulgaria. It is very difficult to give a prescription how to cope with this problem. But we have to a large extent a kind of a facade democracy and a lot of behind the scenes bargains, political bargains. It's difficult to say that our Minister of Defense or Deputy Ministers of Defense are direct representatives of the people, of the Bulgarian nation. The disposition of political leadership is changing due to reasons that are difficult to understand and that are never explained to the public in a reasonable way. Another problem is so-called foreign embassies-driven democratic control over the armed forces. You know, the WikiLeaks cables gave us a lot of insight into how policies is implemented all over the world. We have interesting cables about American-Bulgarian relations, and ways the American embassy is trying to influence Bulgarian defense policy using the concept of DKF and TESAR for its national interests, which do not necessarily, which are not necessarily the same as Bulgaria's national interests. Another important problem is fetishizing the so-called civilianization of the defense ministry. Many experts thought that putting civilians on the main posts in the Ministry of Defense would solve the problems and would lead to better civilian control. But in fact, it turned out that many of these civilians that were put on the political level, in fact, were officers in the reserve from the army or from different other security structures. We have even our present Minister of Defense is a retired general, which in itself is not bad, but it is difficult to identify civilians with officers in the reserve. And this is to stress the relativity of civil-military relations in Bulgaria. Another problem is fragmentation and even privatization of some elements of the security sector. We have lack of coordination between different elements of the security sector. I'll show you later kind of an architecture of our national security system. And something that is very important, we have lost kind of national ownership over democratic control over the armed forces and over the security sector processes, which is really very dangerous. And we cannot close the gap between society and security sector so far. Briefly on the evolution of the constitutional and the legal framework of DKF and TESAR in Bulgaria. In general, we have a good constitutional and legal framework. We have problems in implementing the good requirements and stipulations of the Constitution and of the different laws. And these legal acts are very often changed, which creates kind of chaos in the system. The main players are four: the Parliament, the government, the President, and the judiciary. They should control and implement democratic oversight over the Bulgarian army. This picture is just to show you the complexity of the security sector architecture in Bulgaria. We have many bodies in different ministries, outside of ministries, and it's really very complex to coordinate these bodies and to control them after all. These are the main acts, the main legal acts for DKF in Bulgaria. I would focus on the role of NGOs and the media in DKF and TESAR. It's very important, and unfortunately, there are no more than 10 NGOs that deal with these problems in Bulgaria, and they are underfunded, in fact, and they do not exercise their work constantly on daily basis. And the academic institutions that deal with these problems are 2 or 3. So overall, we have limited capacity to exercise civilian control with NGOs. On the other hand, in the media sector, there is more or less kind of oligarchic control and many corporate interests, and it's difficult to say that the media exercises proper democratic control over the media sector. There is this democratic control by scandals, which is usually used by different lobbies from the security sector in their turf wars with other lobbies. And as a conclusion, I would say it is absolutely unthinkable that the Bulgarian army would interfere in the political life of the country. But it's not the same with the police. Our main problems are with the police, not with the army, because there is constantly growing threat of police violence, electronic surveillance, and use of police forces and methods in the fight with political opponents, which is really dangerous, and it shows kind of trend to moving in the direction of a police state. Therefore, the focus in Bulgaria should be on the police, and especially on the civilian political leadership of the Ministry of Home Affairs, and not on the Bulgarian army and on the Ministry of Defense itself. So this is the experience from Bulgaria. Maybe it's not the same in the countries in the Western Balkans, but my main conclusion is that NATO and EU membership does not lead to solving all the problems, and you should be very careful about the police. The focus should not be only on the military. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nikolai, for this interesting presentation on Bulgaria. Our next presenter is from one of the organizers, the hosts here. This is Marko Savkovic, who is going to present an interesting paper on the issue of transparency in the related to the security sector. And his title is "The Public Has No Right to Know, Is Transparency Good for Researching Peace?" His background is in researching security, and particularly he's written a chapter on Kosovo-Serbia relations, and he's written widely on other security issues as well. And his research includes questions of accountability and transparency in the security sector, peace support operations, the politics of EU security and defense in the Western Balkans.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. The paper I'm going to present is actually research in progress. So I have tried to borrow the model of constitutional democracy and to see whether I could understand the patterns of elite accommodation and power sharing in Macedonia. Why I have chosen Macedonia, where it's pretty simple, actually. This country has experienced it all in 20 years since its independence. And somehow I felt that the experiences brought by the implementation of the Ohrid Framework Agreement are generally unknown to the wider public. And there are, of course, many important lessons to be learned from this process. I would like to begin by actually referring to the fact that it is always difficult to broker peace when each and every side has to give so much in terms of concessions to that other side. This is especially difficult in a multi-ethnic context, yet this presumption of decision makers that public is generally responsible and it shouldn't have access to every phase of conflict resolution actually goes against the very essence of consensus-based democracy. Speaking from a standpoint of someone working in a civil society organization, I always stress that we need different actors of civil society to get involved in order to make political elites accountable, because they do not believe in deals which are brokered under the table, and they speak of what is in best interest of citizens. Yet peace negotiations entail difficult concessions, and those who are supposed to benefit have little or no knowledge of what they are all about. What were the limits of elite accommodation in pre-conflict Macedonia, pre-2001 Macedonia? Well, first of all, this was a marriage of interest between ethnic Macedonian and Albanian politicians. They have accommodated their competing interests since they had little other options left on the table. As long as these elites restrained from interfering in each other's business, to put it plainly, peace was preserved. Yet it was precisely this elite accommodation that actually reduced motivation for reaching a compromise, historical compromise as some can call it, between the two communities. Now, as the hostilities have broken out in 2001, and another important actor has reasserted itself in the face of National Liberation Army, the new pattern of, actually the new approach to conflict resolution was implementation of different premises of power sharing. This power sharing came to be with the Ohrid Framework Agreement, but it was primarily accepted because political and material cost of leading a prolonged conflict and inability to achieve a clear military victory. Second, there was a record of cooperation between elites, and probably most importantly, the vested interest of the international community, which was yet finding its approach to the region as a whole, especially after November 2000. As for negotiations that led to the signing of the Ohrid Framework Agreement, it is today obvious that both sides have played their game on and off the table, and when further pressure was necessary, representatives of participating parties would simply turn to media in their own language. This is how many aspects of what was agreed upon reached the press and thus the wider public long before the OFA was actually signed. Yet for citizens of Macedonia, the most immediate concern was the one of personal security, which was by June 2001 greatly endangered. The threat to use force and international community's determination to prevent it were nevertheless present throughout negotiations, especially if we refer to incidents in June, July, and August of 2001, the Arachinovo, Ljuboten attacks on Macedonian forces, and so on and so on. So what are the premises of power sharing in post-conflict Macedonia? As we all know, first is the formal recognition of the Albanian language. Then we had the difficult process of decentralization of government, revision of municipal boundaries under international supervision, double majority principle, which I will explain a bit later, with the goals of establishing a decentralized system of government, equitable representation of different ethnic communities, enhanced linguistic rights, and free use of flags and symbols. Have these premises been achieved, been realized 10 years later? This record of implementation is, of course, that successive governments have managed to reach the level of representations which was promised to non-majority communities. They have, in one sentence, opened the state to Albanian community. And we are now close to that percentage of their participation in the population of Macedonia. The purpose of constitutional amendments, however, was to enhance the civic character of Macedonian state by not referring to specific ethnic groups, which happened with the Dayton Peace Accords, as we all know. Yet there are a number of controversies. First, weren't the ones who started the conflict rewarded for their actions, referring especially to the experience of the NLA and its transformation to the Democratic Union for integration. Second, hasn't party affiliation instead of knowledge and merit became the first criterion on deciding whether someone is fit to serve in public administration? Thirdly, has not the growing importance of parties becoming the official interpreters of Ohrid Framework Agreement prevented many citizens from accessing the benefits that it had originally provisioned? And fourthly, hasn't the double majority principle turned Macedonia, in fact, into a binational state, since it has worked as a de facto ethnic veto? I would conclude this part by saying that the power sharing system which the OFA has put in place did not affect the ethnic conception of political life in general. Second, it has neither solved the issues of Macedonian statehood and nationhood, which were being and are being contested even today. This we can see from the ongoing issue of the name dispute with Greece, and also in the internal political debates in Macedonia itself. Thirdly, there hasn't been Actually, they have appeared, but they are not so influential, actors which are serving as cross-cutting cleavages or non-state entities that duly reflect the multi-ethnic character of Macedonian society. So the model of consortial democracy has yet to succeed. And in words of this debate between what is the spirit of the framework agreement and what is the wording of the framework agreement, these actors alone, referring to civil society especially, perhaps can help decision makers find that spirit, not only its wording. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco, for this concise presentation. We will now have our last presenter, who is from University of Oxford, Cvete Koneska, and she is going to present a very insightful paper on the failure of power and focusing on the police reform in Bosnia. Cvete has had a very interesting career, and she has started her studies at the American University in Bulgaria, then proceeded to do her master's in the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies at the UCL in the UK in London. And then she continued her work on these security-related issues in the think tank Analytica in Skopje. And then she started her PhD at the University of Oxford, focusing on the political elites in post-conflict states, and in particular comparing the post-conflict experiences of Bosnia and Macedonia and investigating how these political elites accommodate across ethnic and ideological lines. One of the areas that she's looking at is the police and military reform, which she's going to talk about now.
Thank you, Katerina, for your nice introduction, and thank you to the colleagues who actually made a very good introduction about the idea of security sector reform and civil-military relations. So I will not spend too much time explaining it, and sort of having the misfortune to be the last presenter, we tried to be as concise as possible, although I can't possibly promise an interesting presentation. I'll try to make police reform as interesting as possible. But so what I'm going to talk about is try to explain why police reform was not successful in Bosnia. And this is a puzzle that is not new necessarily, right? A lot of people, a lot of scholars have addressed this problem, and there's plenty of literature out there. What I try to do is to offer a fresh sort of interpretation, to look at the question of police reform and the question of ethnic accommodation over sensitive issues such as police reform from a bit different perspective. So how security sector reforms are usually approached in social science literature is most commonly through the democratization perspective. I mean, you've heard my colleagues today speak about how SSR is part of the whole democratization project and includes a lot of sort of different ways of establishing democratic control, sort of introducing democratic values in what used to be not the strongest pillar of democracy, where sort of more authority, power, and hierarchy rather than transparency and accountability were the values that were driving the security sector. And a related, and although not necessarily independent approach, has been to look at the progress of security sector reforms in post-conflict context as driven by the external actors. And when I say driven by external actors, there's two strands of literature. One is the intervention, sort of, or immediate post-conflict external influence, which is usually takes the form of, for instance, either military or civilian missions of some international organizations, or screening, or immediate sort of technical and other assistance for reforming the armed groups that were involved in the conflict. The other type of external influence or external drive for security sector reforms is what we've heard today as well on several occasions, is the pull of the EU and NATO, or sort of the pull of the Euro-Atlantic integration as a sort of a drive towards introducing those democratic principles in the security sector and through the different mechanisms, most usually through different conditionalities, inciting, incentivizing the domestic political elite, the domestic society to proceed with security sector reforms. Now, I'm not arguing here that these two approaches, theoretical approaches, have no merit. They do. But I find the explanations for the failure of security sector reform that these literatures can offer are quite limited in the case of police reform in Bosnia. I mean, short of acknowledging that Bosnia has failed to democratize properly and that the pool of the European Union and NATO membership for some reason is not strong enough for Bosnia as it is for other countries in the region, there's very little else that they offer as an argument or as an explanation for the failure of police reform, especially when you take into account the fact that, for instance, military reform in Bosnia has been quite successful, or at least relatively more successful than police reform. So I turn to another potential set of explanations, which is the institutionalist literature. Now, institutions matter, and today in social science is nothing new to say this, right? Everyone knows that institutions matter, and the type of democratic or non-democratic institutions a society has definitely have a bearing on sort of the political process as well as the outcomes of the reforms processes. Now, it was already mentioned here that Bosnia has a specific, Bosnia, like Macedonia, has a specific institutional setup design. It's power sharing, and in Bosnia it's a bit more complex power sharing, nevertheless power sharing institutional setup with extensive veto mechanisms, as well as a certain set of requirements for executive coalitions, which in Bosnia are only required at the state level, but there's no requirements for that at the entity level, which I think is a big problem in terms of getting the political elites to agree over sensitive issues. So how these institutions and the incentives or the obstacles that they provide for certain reform, I think, could provide a better explanation of why certain reforms are more successful than others. And in addition to this, to these incentives that the formal institutions, the formal power-sharing setup of the Bosnian state provides, there's another set of factors out there which interact with the formal institutions and produce these specific outcomes, and these are the informal practices and rules that political elites tend to be constrained equally as by the formal institutions. Now, the problem with informal practices is that they're very difficult to study because they're not out there set up for you in the constitution or in the laws, so going there as a researcher is very difficult to put your finger on it, yet everyone would tell you that informal networks, informal practices and rules are equally binding, or perhaps sometimes even more so than the formal constraints. So my argument is that the incentives provided by the formal and informal institutions in Bosnia are conflated to produce failure in this specific case. And the details of police reform are more or less, in Bosnia, more or less known, so I'm not going to spend time explaining the details. I'm just going to offer you two snapshots, 2 points where I think this is most visible. And one is the first point where formal institutions fail to provide a venue for properly initiating the reform process, is the introduction of the Defense Reform Commission by the High Representative at the time, Lord Paddy Ashdown. Now, as I mentioned, in Bosnia, despite the complex power-sharing setup, there's no requirement for interethnic coalitions at the entity levels. Yet security, and police in particular, is a competency that is devolved to entities, not at the state. Therefore, the state-level coalition cannot initiate reform, cannot provide a venue, a space, so to say, where people who could negotiate police reform could meet and discuss reforms. Therefore, the system, the political and constitutional system, does not provide formal space for that. That's why the High Representative had to introduce the Police Reconstruction Commission, just like the Defense Reform Commission before that, in order to create this semi-formal space where reforms could take place. The problem, though, with this is that this is not part of the democratic political system of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's not like these reform commissions are sort of an ad hoc bodies created by the international community. They're not accountable to anyone. There's very little democratic oversight over them, and they're not in any direct way integrated with the parliaments, with the judiciary. So they're basically a bit of an alienated body out there, which nevertheless is given the authority to take the reform on. The problem is also that the rules of conduct are quite arbitrary, and while for the Defense Reform Commission you have consensus voting, for the Police Reconstruction Commission that was not the case. So without vetoing consensus, very expectedly, the members of the Police Reform Commission did not manage to come to an understanding because everyone felt threatened that had they not had right to veto, they cannot ensure that their interests will be properly protected. The second such instance is after the failure of the Police Reconstruction Commission and the sort of second attempt at initiating police reform in Bosnia, which was during the time of High Representative Miroslav Lajčák. He abandoned this idea of reform commission, but nevertheless stuck to another informal type of body, which is the top party leaders' meetings, which are even more than the reform commissions. They're even less democratic. First of all, they're not open for the public or the media. No one knows what are the rules of conduct, who votes, does anyone vote at all, and to whom these bodies are accountable or responsible, and how the citizens can gain access to information or even exercise any minimal control over what has been discussed. Yet this was the single most frequent and often the single most favored by the international community method of conducting reforms. And I mean, as a little side remark, it's not just Bosnia, right? Top leaders meetings are quite a common feature of politics in many other countries, which are often sort of encouraged, not by the international community, every time there's a need to resolve a problem. And these two instances of informal practice, of informal sort of institutional spaces, were made possible exactly because the formal institutional setup was not providing a democratic enough space or any space for initiating reforms. And so the question is, why does this matter at all, right? I mean, formal or informal institutions, if you do not manage to have successful reform, it doesn't matter. Yet my argument is that this is a usually overlooked but yet very important and influential part of politics in post-conflict and especially in divided societies. Because in a situation of weak political institutions, weak democratic institutions, as we have in Bosnia in the post-communist and post-conflict context, the establishment of such informal, a bit alienated institutional spaces from the democratic political system further weakens democratic institutions and hollows them out from those little authority and power they are vested in with the Constitution. For instance, sort of displacing negotiations from Parliament, where they usually are conducted in democracies, to some ad hoc bodies, takes the democratic competency of Parliament to sort of be the venue of debate and negotiations and sort of the whole accommodation of different interests, and makes democracy even weaker. On the other hand, these societies are judged, they're evaluated on the strength of their institutions, on the strength of their democracy, and then they're constantly demanded to perform better. Now, this is a bit contradictory, and I'm not arguing here, obviously, for abolishing these informal little practices because they help out the inter-ethnic relations, but this does open questions about what kind of democracy we can expect in societies with power sharing and with ethnic divisions. We usually tend to think in like sort of a very linear, binary division. You either have the liberal democracy of the Western societies, and then you have the group collective-based rights democracy. But I think this doesn't capture the whole story, because this, I think in addition to these axes, we need to add another one, how formal or informal a democracy is. And perhaps, if we're going to be fair to democracies, to countries like this, certain level of informality and weakness of institutions is to be expected, if not encouraged, if at the same time we expect the society to both overcome ethnic divisions and conflict legacies, as well as build a functioning democracy. Now, these are my ideas, just sort of throwing them out there for you, and I welcome all questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Sveti, for this interesting presentation. I'm sure there will be quite a few comments and questions to all of you. I would like to invite those comments and
My name is Saeed Baron. I have a question for Mr. Pavlov, and that is about your comments about security forces and Bulgarian democracy. Um, you mentioned that military, if I quote you correctly, you mentioned that military is not a threat to the Bulgarian democracy. So my question is, if you look at the current prime minister, Mr. Borisov, he seems to come from the security establishment, and it also seems that he, during his tenure, has very much cemented a lot of security cooperation under the prime minister's office on one hand, and then on the second hand, increased intelligence and security cooperation with foreign countries. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about that. Thank you.
yes.
Thank you. My name is Danko Aleksic. I have some comments and a question for Ms. Koneska. First of all, regarding situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we can discuss is there a real democracy in a country with the institution of high representative or special representative with bond powers. Then your statement that state-level coalition could not initiate the reform. I don't understand it fully, because as far as I know, presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina initiated a defense reform in 2001, and it was very successful. Thank you.
Any other questions? I shall then give you the chance to answer the questions. Sveti, do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your comments and questions. Real democracy, right? I'm not the authority on democracy out there, so there's plenty of definitions you can refer to and classify Bosnia as a democracy, non-democracy, partly free, semi-democracy. There's a whole range of points where, depending on your criteria for democracy, you can place a certain society on. And but then, what is the real democracy, right? What is the essence of democracy? I don't know. You name it. Free elections, perhaps. Do we go for a bit of more inclusive definition? I think taking that path towards sort of understanding the political process in a society, at least for my research, would not yield much, because you end up in a sort of discussion about definitions which doesn't yield much. Now, to your comment about the presence of the High Representative, it's not the first time that the High Representative has stayed as long as it has in Bosnia. There's plenty of states out there. For instance, post-war Germany had a High Representative until quite late, after the Second World War, and I mean, it was still considered a democracy. This is not, I think, the issue whether Bosnian political system functions in a democratic way, or what we consider a democratic and efficient way, or not. For me, the problem was conducting or attempting to conduct political reforms outside of the constitutional system or outside the institutions that the Constitution provides for. And defense reform commissions, police reform commissions, or party leaders' meetings, that's not part of the institutions of Bosnia as the Constitution provides for. So for me, that's where the problem, but that's for my research, and I completely take your point that there's many different ways we can think about Bosnia. About state-level coalitions, now, I didn't spend much time discussing sort of the whole institutional outlook of Bosnia, how power sharing works. First, because I think a lot of people know, and then also it's quite complicated, but the idea of executive coalitions, of obligatory executive coalitions, as you have in Bosnia only at the state level, is that you have every group represented there. And but the problem is that this, as I said, the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina government doesn't have the competency of defense. Now, the presidency in Bosnia and Herzegovina is not an institution that can initiate legislation. So perhaps the presidency did pass a resolution or a declaration, I think. It was about the willingness to join NATO, which served as sort of an incentive for starting the reforms, but did not run. Neither did it conduct. If the presidency could do that, could instruct parliaments to discuss, perhaps that would have happened, right? There would have been no need for the Defense Reform Commission. Whereas if you have at the entity level governments, which would be coalitions, and include all of the three constituent peoples in Bosnia, it would be easier to reach consensus between the three groups rather than going in a space venue which is outside the political system and getting the three groups to discuss there, reach some sort of agreement, and then take this understanding and bring it to entity parliaments. Which works, right? It's efficient at least. They go there, discuss as long as it takes or not, and eventually reach an agreement. And then entity parliaments rubber stamp it. But that takes from parliaments the legitimate sort of authority that they have to be the venues of democratic discussion and negotiation. So that's what I was aiming at with such comment. I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Thank you for your question. A very good one. Very good one. Well, don't ask me to criticize my prime minister. I won't do so. But he's a general retired from the police, not from the military. Let's make the distinction. He's general retired from the police and not from the military. One of my points was that in terms of democratic control, we don't have much problems with the defense institution, but we have problems with the police institution. And according to me, the role of the parliament, its constitutional role, should be heightened. The parliament, it's not playing its constitutional role presently, and maybe we must focus in this respect. I don't know the situation in Serbia, but in my country, the role of the parliament should be increased in terms of democratic control, and we must not personalize too much, because institutions remain, and the prime minister will change in a year and a half, but the role of the parliament as an institution should be increased, and it has the constitutional framework for this. So that's my main point. And we must make really the distinction between the military and the police forces. The role of the police forces, for me, the problem is there, in the police forces. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Nikolai. And just to close this discussion, I actually have one question as well to both Nihat and Marko. I was just, because part of what I've looked at in the past is the issue of ethnicity, and when it comes to policing. Do you think that, how do you think in the Balkans, or in Balkan countries, which are so, in some ways, so ethnically divided, how do you think ethnicity should be accommodated in the police or security sector reform? Should this be done? Should it be promoted, or should it be marginalized in terms of more centralized security forces? What do you think? Yeah.
From my point of view, in fact, we are, as also my friend mentioned, focusing more on the armed forces. But when we say security sector reform, we should also include police forces, paramilitary forces, internal security forces, and most importantly, intelligence services. Armed forces have tanks, bomber planes, submarines, but if the intelligence, by using electronic surveillance devices, listening to the phone calls of opposition leaders, and then they are published somewhere, it is more disastrous for democracy. So we are too much focusing on armed forces and ignoring the civilians' capability or power of abusing the military. And in analyzing the civil-military relations, we should see it as a system of sharing responsibility accompanied by mutual trust, working for common purposes and goals, not seeing the military establishment as the enemy of democracy. We shouldn't forget that in Romania and in Serbia, transition to democracy came with the, in Romanian case, inactivity, in Serbian case, activity of the military establishments. In 2000 revolution, military played an important role in ousting Slobodan Milosevic. And in Romania, the armed forces stayed inactive in the calls of the government to suppress all the protesters in 1989. But the Securitate killed 1,000 people, and the armed forces fought the loyal forces to Ceausescu. So military is not an obstacle always for democracy, and civilians can make mistakes. Civilians can also politicize the army and invite the military into politics. So it should be a clear balance. Politicians and officers have great responsibilities for democracy. It's not one-sided game.
Okay, thank you. Marko, what do you think?
I can only add to what Mihat has said, that once you have actors who are gaining special competences, it is very difficult for these actors to decide to just not use them and just to decide not to have these competences anymore. I mean, it is simply a growing trend that we have seen since 9/11, I think, and in Serbia now we have sort of, at least we experienced a brief period of inflation of actors who have been receiving these special competences. And I think it's fair to say that not only police, we have mentioned security services, but also we now have special investigative units. We have new bodies being formed in several ministries, which are primarily civilian ministries that are not considered parts of this hardcore security sector. So at least what we do in our research, we try to take them as a whole, as part of the security sector, but we not only confine ourselves to Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defense, we also know the distinction between Ministry of Interior and uniformed police, which takes the brunt of actually policing and answering these threats to order and security. And also we have the distinction between civilian and military intelligence or security services, and a number of actors that are evolving and receiving more and more competences. So it is a growing trend. It is perhaps a threat to civil liberties, but this is something that researchers have to answer, and I don't think that only police, we should take care of others as well.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? If there's no other questions, then I will close this panel today and give you all a little bit of a break before we start with the next one.